Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I've got quite an ambitious schedule for today. So, we're not only going to be busting some climate myths, and believe me, there are so many more that I could have tackled in this session. And if you do have questions about some that you wish I'd covered, either there might be time later or connect with me on LinkedIn or an email afterwards and ask me some stuff. But yeah, we'll be doing some climate myth busting, and we'll also be thinking about what is it that you as a business can be doing to get a little bit greener. We're not asking for the world. We just had a breakout room discussion where Sarah was mentioning the massive corporates that have all these resources that they can plug into sustainability, and what can we do as SMEs? So the disparity is so massive, but actually there are ways that we can become greener, and there are ways that we can capture the economic benefit of doing so, and that's super important. So, who am I and why do I deserve to be talking here? That's arguable, but I've got a background in sustainability at the very least. So, I was with an award-winning sustainability charity and consultancy called Bioregional for 4.5 years. Coming to that fresh out of uni, did a master's in environment development and policy, did an undergrad in music. So, I've had a bit of a career pivot, but I guess that makes me sometimes, if you ever go for a drink with me, I might treat you to a little song or something. We can go for karaoke. And then I've also done 6 years at Oxfordshire Green Tech, which is the zero carbon business network that I now run as chief exec. I've also put some fairly pretentious stuff here just to be like, oh yeah, cool, I'm ED 30 under 30, 2023, yeah, whatever. That's like an award thing from like a sustainability magazine in the UK celebrating young sustainability leaders. It doesn't mean much, but hopefully it gives you some amount of confidence that I might know what I'm talking about. And if you think that I don't, then feel free to challenge me. Very open to that. Also very happy to share my resources and references that I've used throughout, and very happy to have a little discussion or debate as wanted. We're just going to jump straight into the myths. I'm going to cover 3 myths today. I said there were so many others that I could cover. I can't cover them all, but let's cover 3. And these are maybe the 3 that are, I think, most relevant to business owners. One of them is this: electric vehicles are worse for the planet than internal combustion engine vehicles. And this is relevant because for the UK, our emissions profile has about 1/5 of our total emissions being linked to transportation. And sort of private car usage is really up there as a sort of a strong contender for emissions. So when we're thinking about, oh, should I make the switch to EVs? It's an important consideration. And people have a few issues with them. The batteries within EVs use conflict materials like lithium and cobalt. A lot of cobalt comes from the Congo, for example. There's some real issues, like genuine issues around mistreatment of the humans who live there, around slavery and exploitation. That is something that has yet to fully be resolved, I think, and that is still very much a sort of a broader ethical consideration when thinking about batteries in EVs. Batteries as a sort of concept don't really have a strong end-of-life supply chain yet. So at the moment, there's not a sort of huge sort of industry around how we can reuse and recycle batteries and make the most of those resources. That is coming online, but that's still in development. So there isn't a really huge market for that yet. And of course, if you're using an EV and you're charging on a public charger, it's using electricity from the grid, and the grid is not yet 100% renewables or zero carbon energy. All of that to say, despite that, the sort of average emissions of an electric car in the UK are around 58 to 68% lower than an average petrol car. And that's largely due to the fact that the sort of operational phase of that car, i.e. when you're driving it, it's zero tailpipe emissions, right? There are no fuels being burnt in your vehicle when you are using an electric vehicle. And if you're using that vehicle for sort of 10 plus years, even though the sort of mining and extraction of those materials for the battery, the embodied carbon of making the car in the first place, has some sort of environmental impact, that's actually offset by quite a bit by the operational phase of the vehicle in comparison to a fossil fueled or a petrol vehicle car. There's also some companies now that are exploring battery reuse. So Volkswagen and Nissan are having battery reclaim schemes and thinking about how they can use those better. And we recently took a visit to Chelveston Energy Park, which no one has heard of, even though it's like a really significant energy park based up in Bedfordshire, who have a really interesting sort of JV agreement, I think, with Toyota, where they'll take the sort of batteries from Toyota EVs once they've reached end of life, and they'll stack those batteries together to create fuel, like power cells, essentially, for the energy site, which is super cool. And it's just one of the ways that they're trying to make eke out the battery life of those batteries that are coming from those vehicles. And possibly the most significant thing, and I'll show you a nice graph on the next slide, is that the grid is decarbonizing in the UK really rapidly, possibly beyond what people expected it would. So unlike a petrol vehicle, where if you continue to use it, you're still burning fuel, it's still polluting over time, your EV is actually going to become greener over time as the grid continues to decarbonize, because the carbon intensity of the electricity that you're accessing is decreasing. And you can see that in this lovely carbon brief graph here. The UK's electricity was the cleanest ever last year. And the emissions per unit, kilowatt hour unit, have come down by 2/3 in a decade, which is absolutely massive. And I don't know, there's a nice app that you can access which shows you the sort of the like energy source makeup of the grid on any given day. Actually, I think it's done by hour and even maybe by minute. And you can see if it's a really windy day, you can see the wind energy is just like off the scale and solar's up, and we've gone off coal as of last year. We shut down our last coal power plant. So our grid is decarbonizing, which just makes the case for electric vehicles even stronger. That's not to say that everyone in the UK should necessarily have an electric vehicle. I believe in a portfolio of transport options that are suitable to where you live. So if, for example, you're like me and you live in Oxford or sort of a smallish city, it just makes a lot more sense for me to cycle or for me to take public transport, because things are smaller, they're closer by, I can access them by bike or by walking. Obviously, if you live in a more rural area, EVs make a lot more sense in that case because you're less connected to public transport. But I think it's a sort of a range of options rather than a silver bullet, everyone should have an EV. And this is just another graph, again, that kind of shows you the sort of life cycle emissions of a petrol car. So the ICE V here and a battery electric vehicle here. So you can really see the difference. And particularly with this sort of, I don't actually know if you can see my mouse, but the difference between the sort of the darker blue fuel consumption bar versus the lack thereof in the BEV column, because there's no fuel being burnt in your electric vehicle when you use an electric vehicle. You're using electricity instead. On to myth 2, because time is rapidly racing on. This is another big one. China is worse and bigger than us, so why should we do anything? This is a big one. Lots of people have said China is by far the world's largest producer of carbon emissions. They're a massive state. They should move before us. We're just a tiny little country. What could we possibly do on the global stage? And so, yeah, in terms of the bad part, or like why that might be the case or why we think that might be true, China does still rely on coal for its industry, and coal is the most carbon intensive fossil fuel that we have. So having coal in their grid is a bad thing. It pushes up the carbon intensity of their electricity. And their industry is really high for their emissions. So in the UK, we don't have as much heavy industry. In China, they have lots. And their sort of power industry in particular it makes up a huge amount of their carbon emissions. And China also creates a huge number of products, and that's related to industry. And the big but there is, and don't laugh, that's immature, is who is buying those products? It's us. Like, we are directly procuring a lot of these products from China. I won't go into like scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, because that's a much larger rabbit hole than we have time for. But basically what that means is, although China is burning coal and producing these things, and those are their emissions that they have to own and take responsibility for, we also own those emissions indirectly by procuring from China and creating that demand for those products. So we're implicated as well. And actually per capita or per person emissions for China are far less than other countries like the United States, for example. So even though China as an entity produces a lot of carbon emissions, per person, their lifestyles are much less carbon intensive than you might think. Also, hopefully you would have seen some of the news about this, but China is rolling out solar and wind power like no one's business. They set a sort of quite ambitious 2030 renewables target for solar and wind power, and I think nuclear as well, of 1,200 gigawatts of energy. They've already hit that target 6 years ahead of schedule and 4 years after they even set the target. So they have gone absolutely crazy on making sure that they can roll out solar and wind and be ahead of the curve in terms of renewable generation. And given what we were talking about before with electric vehicles, they're also home to 70% of global manufacturing capacity for electric vehicle batteries. And they're rolling out EVs super fast as well. We work with a few people who have sort of delegations that they take across to China, climate tech delegations, because the Chinese are so interested in what's being developed in our sort of ecosystems, especially out of the University of Oxford and Cambridge and London, and seeing what our climate tech products are like there. And they said that when they went to Beijing, the sort of difference in air quality is really noticeable because China have started rolling out a lot of electric buses. And I'm talking a lot. Like in the UK, in Oxford, we have a fleet of about, I think it's 30 something electric buses in Oxford, which is like really significant. But in China, it's a different quantum. And that's really going to help with air pollution. That's really going to help driving that move towards electric vehicles. And just to come back to the CO2 emissions again, this is a really cool graph. Check out Our World in Data if you're interested in sort of data and visualization of anything around carbon and climate, because their stuff is really useful. But it's just a note to drive home the kind of the moral implications of not taking action ourselves, because you'll see with this blue line that starts early on for the United Kingdom, for a lot of history, we have been leading the way in terms of the amount of carbon emissions that we produced. We started the Industrial Revolution. We started that coal usage, and other countries just followed suit. And we benefited a lot from the development that has brought, but we also had to take ownership of that. Our historic emissions are something that has benefited us and our progress, but also something that we now need to account for, because if other nations are also to develop and to get that sort of equity and that fairness to scale, then we need to power down quicker perhaps than other nations would have to, because of that historic responsibility that we are entitled to take account for. And then this is just a nice visualization of some of the sort of Chinese like plans for different sort of clean energy bases. And you can see, if this is like the whole of China, you can see like these are significant sites. There are significantly large sites. So we're not just talking like a little piddling 2 panels on a roof done. We're talking significant solar farms and wind farms and nuclear and hydro and lots of other things. And I won't dwell too long on this, but just this last bar here. So this is, I think, automotive sales in 2023 in China. You can see that over a quarter of their automotive sales were electric vehicles. I think that, I can't remember, but I think that is above the UK average, and that's significant. Myth 3, it's too late to do anything. Climate breakdown is inevitable. That's another sort of big barrier we hear to climate action. And the bad part is it's not entirely wrong. Climate change is already here and it is threatening life across the globe. We saw the LA wildfires recently, the flooding in Valencia last October, worsening droughts and conditions in sub-Saharan Africa, forest burning in the Amazon, the sort of decrease of biodiversity and species, non-human nature. There's been like a 70% decrease in overall biodiversity globally since the 1970s. And that's horrifying. That's a number that we should never have to be contending with, but we are. So the situation is bad. And we've also breached that sort of 1.5 degrees of warming that was established as a target back in Paris 2015 at the COP summit, which said we really shouldn't allow warming to go above 1.5 degrees because we don't really know what the implications of that will be. The bad news is that we have breached that as of last year, but we haven't breached that for 20 years in a row, which is technically the amount of time that you need to have breached the target by in order to say, okay, that's our new normal. So the good news is we can regress on that. We can sequester carbon. We can, as long as we act fast, our ecosystems are resilient and they can bounce back. We have lots of natural carbon sinks around the world. The Amazon rainforest is one of them. The oceans are a huge carbon sink, and just basically greenery in general, like this stuff absorbs carbon. And so the more we can restore nature, build it out, make it bigger. There's someone from the Earth Trust on this call, so very relevant. The more chance we have of sucking that carbon back and reducing the harmful impact it will have. And every percentage of a degree counts. 1.5 is a number that climate scientists have given. 1.6 will be worse. Let's stop getting there. 2 degrees would be worse. 3 degrees would be horrifying. 4 degrees would be unbelievable. Everything matters. We can't just throw our hands up and say, oh, climate change has already happened. It's too late. No, it isn't, because of this slide. So you can see the difference in sort of climate risks. I'm sorry, it's a bit small on the screen, but I can send slides afterwards. You can see the difference in what will happen to the world when you look at a 1.5 degree global warming increase versus a 2 degree of warming. So it's an 100% 100% increase in flood risk now, but it'll be 170% increase in flood risk. In terms of water availability, currently 350 million urban residents will be exposed to severe drought by how would you say that? 2100? How do people say that? 2100? I don't know. I've never had to say that word out loud. That's so weird. Versus almost another 100 million more at 2 degrees. That's a significant amount of people. We can't just be like, nah, humanity screwed, goodbye. Try saying that to the 100 million people that you would be forsaking if we didn't take advantage of trying to stop as much warming as we possibly can. And it goes on, like there's much more costs associated, much more risk associated with 2 degrees. Food and harvest will decline in quality and yield. Coral bleaching will have virtually no coral reefs left by the end of the century if we really don't limit that sort of global warming. So every degree matters. The amount of urgency that we can bring matters hugely. And we can't just wait until 2050, which is when our sort of UK legally binding target is to get to net zero. That's not how climate change works. You can't just like allow it to be really bad and then try and absorb all of it in 1 year before the target. Like the more we expose the globe to climate risks now, the more our natural ecosystems will degrade and they'll be less able to reabsorb that carbon, to reabsorb the negative impacts of what is already happening. So every point of a degree matters. And every week, every day, every hour that we can do something matters, because it's a matter of climate justice as well. Like people in the global south are already experiencing all of this stuff. We're really lucky in the north. We're so privileged that the worst we've experienced is a bit of flooding, maybe a bit of wacky tobacco like weather conditions, but like not that much. Like we've not experienced what other people have experienced, and we need to act on their behalf. It's just, and it's the right thing to do. So why should you care? Hopefully that you should. Hopefully some of what I've just said is resonating. But as a small business owner, we're not exempt from being part of the problem. We are creating nearly half of the UK's non-household greenhouse gas emissions, but there are lots of potential benefits associated with becoming greener. And so lots of people can see the possibilities of reducing waste and energy usage, becoming more efficient as a business, as a real way of saving money. I'm not sure how much time we have to do this part. I'll maybe talk very briefly about neuroplasticity and move on to the sort of actions part. Basically, your brain is plastic. It has the ability to change over the whole of your life. Scientists used to think that once you got to like age 25, you just weren't able to like really change much about the way that you thought or perceived the world. That's not true. You can change at any point, and that's really exciting. And you can form new sort of neuronal connections based on habit making. And I'm sure that people have talked about habit making a lot in this sort of forum, because that seems very relevant to something that Sarah and Pete would like to do. But essentially, the sort of building of habits, and especially around sustainability, start small, get that initial boost of dopamine from having achieved something, and then your brain will get used to that sense of fulfillment. It will crave the dopamine associated with achievement, and you'll be able to do more and more things. It will motivate you to complete the behavior again in the future. It takes a while to set in, and that's obviously like a neurochemical reality that needs time to implement, but it will help. Start small, increase serotonin. Serotonin is the neurochemical associated with willpower. Ways that you can increase serotonin include exercise, sunlight, massage, chocolate. And so these are things that will help you boosting willpower. Celebrate the small victories. If you're a small organization, it can sometimes think, oh, we did like a small thing, but it's tiny in the grand scheme of things. Doesn't matter. Celebrate it. You did it. Build on it. Build momentum. This is just one of our members, who is an amazing company, highest scoring B Corp printing company in the world. They're based in Oxford, so super local. They're a printing company that have managed to revolutionize printing. And I won't go into detail on all the stuff that they do, but if you're interested in finding out more about them, check out their website and their story. It's super inspiring. In terms of the big things that need to happen and the things that you can do as a business owner, the big reality I've put in like black, and then the sort of reality for how it manifests to you as a business, I put in green. As a global community, we need to keep fossil fuels in the ground. What that might look like for you could look like campaigning as a business against the development of sort of fossil fuel fields, but it also could look like switching to a green tariff, encouraging the take up of renewable energy into your business. And deploying renewable energy on your buildings if you can. If you work from home, maybe explore solar panels on your building. In terms of sustainable transport, try to cycle more if you can, use public transport, car sharing. EVs I've covered already, I won't cover again. Food is really important. We waste a third of all food produced globally. That a third is just gone. It's lost across many different parts of the supply chain, but lots of it is related to wastage from ourselves, from food being too wonky, from, lots of different things. So not wasting is important. And also moving to more plant-heavy diets is super important as well. Switch out your sort of beef burger or your lamb burger for something a bit lighter. A nice lentil burger, tofu, whatever it is. There's some really good and healthy things out there nowadays. Insulation is super important. We have in the UK the leakiest housing stock in Europe. Our buildings are trash. They're so leaky, so energy inefficient, and could be costing you loads of money. So explore retrofit options. Restoring and protecting nature. If you have green space at your office, could you enhance that in some way so that it's not just a monoculture of just grass? Are there ways that you can make wildfire meadows to encourage bees and other sort of, I was going to say, pollinating insects? Or get involved with community projects. And in terms of reducing consumption, that's a good one. Get an energy audit. Find out where the energy is being wasted in your organization. Find an organization called Low Carbon Hub if you're an Oxfordshire-based organization. They do energy audits for a very cheap price, and they give you a really comprehensive report on how you can take quick wins with no to low costs to save you energy. LED light bulbs are also another way of really quickly and quite cheaply saving money on electricity usage. LEDs are very efficient. And you can also do a material/procurement audit. Do you need all the stuff you have as a business, or can you reduce the amount of consumption you do in general? And reduce plastic, that's, I think everyone's bored to death about plastic. We talk about plastic all the time. Okay, so I'm a bit over time, so I'll stop there now. And I think that was a bit of a roller coaster, but hopefully something was useful out of that.
Oh, I thought that was brilliant. Thank you so much, Hannah.